Cool. So we'll get started. Just want to say a big thank you to CSA for allowing us to be a sustaining partner this year. We really appreciate the partnership. Of course, to Palo, I have to say it, for giving us this beautiful venue. Today's session is going to be all about SaaS security. So SaaS adoption, how the concept of SaaS security has changed over the past couple of years. And hopefully everyone will come away from today with a better understanding of maybe different things that you can consider as you look to implement security controls and programs around your SaaS clouds. I think a lot of people in the room probably have a good understanding of cloud security, I would hope, infrastructure as a service and pipeline security. I want people to think about how they can take what they know about that and apply it to the world of their SaaS applications. With me, so I'm Brandon Ramasher. I manage the EMEA business for AppOmni, and we're very fortunate today to have my colleague with us. This is Aaron Costello, our Chief of SaaS Security Research. He's a humble guy, but reality is I think he's the global thought leader in what he does. So I'm gonna talk for a couple minutes. It won't be all that interesting. And then we're gonna have Aaron come up and talk about what he does from an offensive security research perspective on some of the biggest SaaS platforms out there, some examples of the reports that he's published, and he'll talk you a little bit through the day in his life. Maybe just a little bit of an icebreaker. So if we think about what's in your SaaS security program today, Sean was talking about this a little bit already, is the concept of third-party risk and vendor reviews, right? When you think about the shared responsibility model for SaaS, there's two sides of the equation. It's what is the vendor going to take responsibility for, and what is the end customer who's consuming the SaaS going to take responsibility for, right? And the two different sets of controls that you have to think about implementing. So when you think about third-party risk and vendor reviews, you're really assessing, can I trust the cloud provider to uphold their side of the shared responsibility model? Are they compliant? Are they securing the underlying infrastructure, the application, right? Everything that's abstracted away from the SaaS consumer as an end customer, are they managing that correctly and properly? So just show of hands, who does this as an organization today? Who conducts third-party risk reviews on their vendors and their providers? All right, not a great start. It's about a third of the room. I expect it to be a little bit higher. I think it's probably higher, to be honest, when you talk to other parts of the organization. So as we move along the line and we talk about a little bit more about maybe what Paul was referencing, and that's around IAM and security to SaaS clouds, right? Maybe that's Zero Trust Network Access, SASE, SSE solutions, IAM and IDP providers like Okta, who has some controls around governing the flow of authentication of your users into a SaaS application? Just show of hands. Great, guys. This isn't looking so good for you. You might need to be talking to us. Okay, and then this is last but not least. This is what we want to focus on today. This is security of SaaS clouds. And I think that's what I want everyone to come away with today, is that there's a big difference between security to SaaS clouds and security of SaaS clouds. Right, when we think about security of SaaS clouds, it's those questions of, are my SaaS clouds securely configured? All of those native configuration settings that exist within the SaaS platforms that those vendors expose to your administrators, all of those complicated data access models and permissioning that you provision from within the SaaS application, all of those connected applications from those app exchange stores that Sean showed that your users can go to and download and plug into your production environment without anyone taking a look at it. Right? We're going to talk about what you can be doing to get comprehensive and automated coverage for what are effectively critical infrastructure in today's organizations. So I stole this from Stu Hurst. I don't know if people know Stu Hurst, and he probably stole it from someone else, but Stu is the CISO at Trustpilot. I love this, right? When you have a policy, you can obviously see it. This is, when I think of what we're talking about today, what security of SaaS clouds looks like in most organizations, I think this is where most people are living, right? They have a trust without verification. There's some written policy somewhere. Maybe it's a minimum controls framework that you apply across multiple layers of your stack and your attack surface around encryption, backup, IAM, et cetera, right? Or maybe it's specific to a SaaS application like M365, right? My conditional access policies must maintain a certain posture, whatever that is. Most people we speak to today either have nothing like that, or they have some sort of paper-based policy that security wrote up somewhere, and they hope and pray that the SaaS application owners are doing something with it. And maybe they do some sort of random check-in with them once a year, once a quarter. There's no way to truly verify that what this policy is saying the application should look and feel like is actually being adhered to. That's the big problem. That's what we're solving for. That's what we're automating for our customers. So sort of rhetorical question, why is this bad? It's bad because SaaS is now the operating system of business. By all intents and purposes, I like to say that IT has left the building. Maybe they manage ServiceNow. Maybe they manage certain parts of the IT infrastructure, if you will, from an application perspective. But your CFO is using Oracle NetSuite. Your developer is using GitHub. Your sales and marketing organization has a big Salesforce deployment. You know, a lot of different people are probably coming in and out of Databricks and Tableau and Snowflake, right? They're all SaaS applications that are delivered by different vendors that have different teams managing them. They're all fundamentally different. Look and feel different, different system settings, right? It's a very complicated web to understand. So when you compare this to the world of IaaS and cloud, it's a very different problem, but it's similar. At least in IaaS, there's three main providers and the settings and the systems are sort of similar and they're very mature from an API perspective. I used to work in IaaS sales here at Palo Alto Networks. And I think our biggest competitor at the time was build versus buy. It was engineers and developers saying, I can go build some of this stuff myself as opposed to buying a third-party CSPM tool. That goes out the door in the world of SaaS. I can promise you that right now. It's too complicated. It's too distributed. And it's too different from provider to provider to actually solve that with a build problem. So you're stuck with either manual processes or hopefully looking at, you know, little plug here, a tool like AppOmni to automate that. And that's the one with my little box right there that I want really people to think about again is SaaS is no longer shadow IT like it was 10 years ago. It's critical infrastructure. If your IDP goes down, if your CRM goes down, if your ServiceNow goes down, right? Insert application here. If that goes down, like what happens to the business? If that data is compromised, what happens to the organization? Probably ceases to function for a little while. This is one of the big problems. This is from a big survey that we did as an organization. We surveyed about 1,000 people globally, a bunch of people here in the UK, mostly security professionals. And the outcome was that no one's really taking security responsibility for SaaS. Ultimately, something bad happens, it's going to fall back on the CISO. That's almost definitive. But if you look at that middle line there, about 34% of people said business owners and security teams should work together. And I think that's the right answer. Ultimately, this is a problem that cyber teams, I think, should own, but they need to have other stakeholders closely working with them from a RACI perspective. And then I think that 50% answer is a really bad thing, to just leave it to them, right? Developers are building applications and they push bad code into the application and something bad happens, who's ultimately responsible? It's usually security. So the same sort of thing applies here. And so there's real world consequences of no one really doing anything with their SaaS applications that they've made big strategic investments in. We're seeing breaches increase. We're seeing incidents increase every year. Not naming shaming anyone, but the big providers, Salesforce, Snowflake, Okta, GitHub. Bad actors are targeting these applications directly. And some of the things that we'll talk about that Aaron's going to really get into, which I think is really interesting, is the bottom stuff here. There's really two different types of, I would say, security events that we're seeing in the world of SaaS. I mean, there's more, but those are the two main ones that we're seeing. One is traditional, identity-based or post-authentication-based attacks. Where bad actors are breaking in and moving along a condensed kill chain to ultimately exfiltrate data. And that's what happens a lot at the top. And what we call that is we call it zero trust bypass a lot of the time, because they're not going through your fancy authentication gateways. They're looking at these applications directly, they're knocking on the doors, and they're realizing that no one's disabled legacy authentication. You might have SAML and SSO set up, but the administrator never disabled the legacy authentication. There's break last account logins, there's all sorts of other things, direct access into these systems, public-facing portals that people can access with very basic attack patterns. Right? We're talking about stolen credentials bought on the dark web, knocking on enough doors and finding an access point directly in the system because it can bypass your controls from an authentication perspective. On the bottom, we're talking about the S3 bucket. It's a little bit more complicated, but S3 bucket problem from 5, 6, 7 years ago. A lot of these SaaS platforms are intentionally configurable to be open to the public internet. for legitimate use cases. Could be customer ticketing, customer support. In the world of finance, it's broker-dealers trying to get quotes from banks. There'll be a lot of different use cases to why you're opening these up to the public. It's very easy for administrators to inadvertently expose everything in the production platform to the internet when they're trying to just break off a little bit of access. And that's the real interesting stuff that we're going to talk about with Aaron in a minute. This is one of the things I just wanted to quickly talk about how posture and threat detection works together in SaaS. So I'm not sure, to show hands again really quick, did people read up on the Midnight Blizzard attack on Microsoft a little bit? You heard about that? So this one's pretty sophisticated because, you know, nation state attackers, right? It's a little bit different, but for the most part, they're a little bit less sophisticated is what we're seeing. But it's pretty simple stuff here, to be honest, right? The bad actors targeted a test environment. They weren't going directly at production. And that's the other thing that we see with these applications is there can be many different environments connected to production. You need to have consistent controls across the board from, you know, hardening and authentication perspectives. They targeted a test environment, basic password spraying. They're able to ultimately hijack OAuth connections, escalate privilege, and use that to move from a test environment eventually into a production environment. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But what they ended up doing is able to get access to Microsoft's internal exchange, which is where they started reading a bunch of sensitive emails and exfiltrating a bunch of sensitive data. And that was the output of the Midnight Blizzard attack. But ultimately, this isn't anything crazy right here. These aren't like super sophisticated attack patterns that are being leveraged. It's just the lack of people looking at it. The lack of Microsoft even looking at their own environment, which is crazy. But that's effectively what we saw. And so these are the different TTPs. There's nothing crazy here. In the pink, those are threat detection rules. From an AppOmni perspective, at least, these are the sort of things that we could identify across different SaaS clouds as they're taking place. And that's fantastic. It can be reactive in nature, but when you overlay that with posture, if you're hardening the system right in the first place, a lot of these things could have been prevented or identified without the attackers ever getting access in the first place. And so there's a couple things here to take away. One is effective SaaS security of a SaaS system requires comprehensive posture hardening, as well as continuous monitoring from a threat detection perspective. Monitoring the audit logs, monitoring the event logs, being able to combine that and look at that across the board, across your different SaaS systems. What we find in our world is that if you get your posture right in the first place, you can reduce the amount of noise from a SaaS perspective of what's going to the SOC by nearly half. And then nearly three-quarters in terms of post-authentication based attacks. So they work hand in hand, and that's how AppOmni works. So here's my selfish plug before I hand it over to Aaron, who's the brains of the operation. We are a SaaS security posture management company. We service about 30% of the Fortune 100 today. Salesforce, ServiceNow, Cisco, Thoma Bravo are all investors in AppOmni. Our founder was previously the CISO of Salesforce, security CTO of ServiceNow. And we specialize purely in helping customers solve this problem. How do you turn on the lights? You had no visibility into the systems before. Without having a deep understanding of what good looks like in a lot of these systems, how do you automate that process? That subject matter expertise in a box, how do you just apply that to your SaaS clouds and in a matter of minutes, get a deep understanding of where your biggest risks are from a misconfiguration perspective and fix those continuously going forward through continuous scanning. So the simple way to think about it is you connect your applications into our platform. We do all sorts of cool things, pulling back configuration data, metadata, user activities, connected applications. We contextualize that all together in our cloud, and we regurgitate that back to you in a meaningful way. But from an operational perspective, we have all sorts of workstream integrations. That means your administrators get the information that they need in near real time to fix their issues. Your incident response team gets alerted when the alarms are going off in certain cloud environments. So we can make sure that the right people are getting access to the right information quickly, the way that they're already doing their work without having to log into our platform if they don't want to. So I hope that was helpful. We're going to spend some time at the end, maybe taking a couple questions, but I'm going to hand it over to Aaron, talk a little bit more about what he does.
Thank you. All right, can everyone hear me? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So AppOmni Labs. So this is the security research function at AppOmni, which I'm the founding member of. So I joined about 4 years ago, and it was established originally because our founders came from a security background within Salesforce and recognized the risk, the unknown, all the security misconfigurations happening across Salesforce customers. And while they knew about Salesforce, the AppOmni tool was never intended to be just a Salesforce security tool. It needed to be platform agnostic. So that's where they brought myself in. And so what do I do? So this is not I would like to call it a threat research function. I am not looking for attacks from threat actors in AppOmni environments. We've got another team for that. I'm looking for novel attacks that can be performed that no one really knows about so that we can effectively prevent threat actors getting their hands on them and providing the vendors ways to provide guardrails and mitigations or perhaps even fixes. So some of you may be familiar with Salesforce, right? And this was the research that originally led myself joining AppOmni. So what is this research? So 4 years ago, before I joined AppOmni, I looked from the background of a bug bounty hunter at ways in which I could effectively report vulnerabilities and make a bit of money by reusing the same type of attack vectors across different organizations, right? And so when you look at SaaS, the Salesforce platform has the same APIs out of the box across all customers. So this, in my opinion, originally was a goldmine opportunity for me. So what I had found was there were completely undocumented APIs that exist on the platform that are enabled by default, that are accessible and are still accessible by unauthenticated individuals. Okay, why does that matter? It matters because absolutely everyone was inadvertently making their data available to the public through the use of these APIs. They originally thought, well, I'm not putting the data on a page and making that page public. You didn't need to. These APIs would query the data straight from the database, and so anyone can get their hands on it. To give you an idea of how widespread this was, so I wasn't working at the time, and for 2 full days and very little sleep, I was reporting this issue to organizations through their vulnerability disclosure programs. And I got to the point where I started just paying my friends to report it for me because I was so sick of writing reports on this stuff, right? I even jumped on a call with Salesforce and their security team. And one of the guys who'd been there for a year was like, I didn't even know this was a thing. I didn't even know that we had this. So I published an article detailing how these things happen and how to prevent against these attacks. So when I joined AppOmni, we productized that scan. So as an automated scan that would, in an unauthenticated fashion, find these issues in our customer instances, right? And that was in 2019. So at the end of 2021, we published further research as part of AppOmni Labs on how to effectively further mitigate these issues. Salesforce at that time had released logging mechanisms, which they had not provided to their customers. So any form of log analysis was hopeless because there was no logs at the time being available, right? So that was published in 2021. And then shooting forward to 2023, Brian Krebs covered this. He had an interview with a security researcher, I believe his name was Akiri, and he was trawling the internet looking for organizations exposing data through Salesforce as a result of customers misconfiguring their access controls. And he was reporting it to those organizations. And right after that was published, we were detecting using our own telemetry in AppOmni, a 300% increase in attacks against our customers. So here's just some brief examples of additional research that I've done throughout the years. And so what I hope you're kind of seeing is it's platform agnostic, right? At the beginning, it was heavily on Salesforce. And we're not just talking about data exposure here. We're talking about the risks of custom development. So Apex, the language being the on-platform language for Salesforce, a white paper on that, kind of explaining to organizations how to securely develop and deploy their own APIs and components. Salesforce flows, which are low code. Then things such as third-party application risk. So that's more what you'll be seeing from threat actors, what kind of Brandon talked about, that as a vector. So I discovered some risk with third-party apps, a case study in which the Irish government was exposing everyone's COVID vaccination information publicly. They deployed a Salesforce portal, which anyone could sign up to. And when you sign up, copy my research or my article, shoot it at the URL, you were getting everyone's PII and all their vaccination details. So I'm Irish, by the way. That was great for me. NetSuite as well, more data exposure, exact same situation, undocumented APIs. No one knows about it. No one's talking about it. The vendor barely even knows that they still have this. ServiceNow, the exact same thing. So I have a bit of a thing for data exposure, and I will be walking through that quite a bit because when I'm looking at Brandon's, what Brandon was talking about with respect to the breaches that we're seeing, like Midnight Blizzard, there is a huge, huge impact there without a doubt. But as a security researcher, I think it's a bit lame, the attack vector. And the reason I think that is because you need to have compromised the instance through one way or another, whether it's session hijacking or supply chain attack or something like that. And that doesn't massively interest me because I think we're at the point where while organizations are struggling to wrangle the kind of third-party application risk and supply chain attacks, they're becoming more and more aware of it, and vendors are getting much smarter with respect to building guardrails around those third-party application risks.
Mandatory MFA finally and things like that as well.
Right, exactly. So how did the vendors respond to my research? So looking back at all the research that I mentioned, these are all things in which the customer, the organizations who purchased these products had misconfigured the access controls. The products, Salesforce, NetSuite, ServiceNow, inherently secure by default. And organizations were messing up their access controls and inadvertently leaking data and things like that. So what did the vendors do about it? Because we're helping customers and we're helping the security community by publishing this stuff. But what I noticed was every single time I published research, vendors would change stuff, right? As a direct result of that research. So we're not only assisting our customers, the public organizations using these products, but also the research is being recognized by these vendors and they're taking action on what I'm saying. So every single piece of research I've done, vendors would add guardrails to help honestly make it more difficult for customers to misconfigure things, provide warnings to customers when they misconfigure an access control, like, hey, you've just made your entire user base public to the internet, and things like that. So that's one example. Another example is they would introduce monitoring capabilities, so additional log sources that previously were not available. And using tools like AppOmni, we're alerting on any events that come through that match these kind of attacks and delivering that to our customers' SIMs. ServiceNow, this is really the interesting one. Up until here, it was guardrails, right? Vendors telling customers, hey, you need to configure this or check this extra box or undo this. But the most recent research, until about 2 p.m. today, ServiceNow made a huge leap and just deployed a fix to all of their customers. It broke a lot of things. I'll be talking extensively about this research, but that is the first time, as a result of my research, and to be honest, I think as a result of any security research in the SaaS, that vendors were like, you know something, we need to actually step in. Our customers are all over the place, whether it's their own fault, the vendor's fault with the lack of documentation, or the customer has just completely messed it up. They stepped in and modified the access controls of over 6,000 organizations. And in order to kind of revert those misconfigurations and just immediately put them into a secure state, right? And naturally, you're going to have customers saying, well, we actually want this functionality. We want X, Y, and Z to be public for whatever reason. And they could undo this change that was made. But they took the approach of, hey, we're just going to push this. You're now secure. Don't blame us if you undo what we've just done. So I'm not a UI or UX designer, so apologies. But I hope you can see this on the back as well. I want to walk through a little bit how I went through the process of identifying this data exposure. And so my key goal with ServiceNow was to find the exact same thing that I found with Salesforce. I wanted undocumented APIs that no one knows about. I wanted no initial foothold required in order to access the data. So completely unauthenticated. And here is a very simplistic view of the platform and the most widely used components. We're talking from the front end, the pages, to the back end, the APIs, and also the database where all that juicy information is stored. And so I was looking at the use cases for ServiceNow. And so they've provided components that are very, very similar to that of Salesforce and NetSuite. So off the bat, REST API, GraphQL APIs, out of the box, they provide a lot of these for you. And they're largely used by web integration users. So your third parties accessing data, not through the UI, but in a programmatic fashion. And the issue with this, when I looked at this from a research perspective, was, well, everyone knows about these. There's no way that ServiceNow has created some kind of public API to just query arbitrary data. And in the event that access controls are misconfigured, leak the data through those APIs. And another thing that I wanted was impact with the finding. I don't like to publish things that have no real impact here. And I knew that organizations would be watching these kinds of APIs like a hawk because they were deploying their own custom APIs as well. So I was looking at the internal users. So users internal to the organization who are actually logging in and have credentials. And so how they were interacting with the platform was they would access some front-end components, called them UI pages. The UI page would call a client callable script to include, which is just another API. And that would return data from the database and populate the UI page. That was no good because, as I said, I wanted unauthenticated. And by very nature, this API is internal only by default, out of the box for all of the client callable script includes that ServiceNow provides. However, when I dug into the use cases of ServiceNow a little bit more, and okay, if I want to use ServiceNow and provide some external functionality, if I was a customer, what would I be deploying? It's not like Salesforce, where you've got your Lightning communities that are very flexible. You can have, so I've even seen people deploy shops on that, right? ServiceNow had a ton of customer use cases for external knowledge bases, okay? So these are being used predominantly for universities to allow their students to access help documentation. So I was looking at this and I said to myself, okay, portal pages are the UI component of the knowledge base. So you access a portal page from a URL, it calls these things called widgets, which are once again an API, gets out from the database and populates the portal page. Here was the problem. I could not control what was being returned on a portal page. I couldn't control what kinds of data that I wanted. I was only getting help articles, and I didn't want help articles. I wanted password hashes and all the good stuff. So, well, in my opinion, it's good stuff. So I thought to myself, well, look, these UI pages, they're just calling these widgets. I'm just going to ignore this completely and dig into these things. And the fantastic thing about ServiceNow is they, like all the other kinds of APIs, deploy a ton of out-of-the-box widgets for every customer to use so they can easily hook up things on their platform and use the ServiceNow components. And they're also open source. So I went and read through a couple hundred of these and the code and looked for every widget that was public by default. And what I also noticed was all of these widgets, these APIs, were created back in like 2015. And you already know, okay? Organizations didn't even know these really existed, like, because they'd never used them. And when they're deploying a knowledge base, they're just thinking about the portal pages. Like, yeah, I want like a support ticket page. I want a knowledge base article page. They weren't thinking of under the hood what's actually being called to get the data and populate the page. And what I found was a widget API where the calling user, and it was public, the calling user could control what table and what fields to extract. And it would return the data of any of those tables and fields that you provided. And immediately, I was like, okay, we're productizing this straight away. So created that scan, and within 24 hours, all of our ServiceNow customers, their instances just lit up with alerts. Everything was misconfigured from an access control perspective. Empty access controls, public access controls, because when you ask, because customers didn't know what this was, when you ask them, why do you have the public role on this table? Like, why it's public? They say, well, there's no consequence to this. Like, show me how you can get this information if I don't put one of these somewhere. So it lit everything up. And we were milking that quite a lot. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I'm milking it quite a lot because it was unique to us. We're the only one that had this and the only one that discovered it. And ServiceNow fixed it. So they looked at the logs of one of our customers and said, oh, we see what you're doing. We're gonna modify the widget you're using and make it secure by default or non-public by default. And I was pretty upset because I like to publish things, and I was riding that productized high for too long that I never got to do that. So naturally, within about 2 hours, I found another widget that does the exact same thing, and I published content on that. So this diagram has a lot of ServiceNow specific concepts, but you could just replace this with Salesforce or NetSuite or a ton of other platforms that have some externally facing functionality like deploying a site. You could really replace it. And every single large scale platform, NetSuite, Salesforce, ServiceNow, that I've looked into has some widget. So that's how I kind of approach this. And so this is how the ServiceNow KB disclosure case study, because through those widgets, one of the main things that were being exposed were internal knowledge base articles of organizations that are meant for employees only. And it's like, okay, well, how juicy can that be? Well, there was a Fortune 20 organization using ServiceNow, and I got about 100-ish, maybe 80 to 100 access tokens to all of their production environments that they use internally, because they for some reason created a knowledge base article with all of it there. So yeah, and so I said, okay, we need to publish a case study on this specifically, and how to prevent this from happening, and how attackers could potentially access it, and just make it real for the security community, for ServiceNow customers, and say, this can actually be done, here's how, and here's how you prevent it. And one of the nice things at the very end was that we got a quote from Ben DeBon, who's the CISO at ServiceNow. It is always nice to get a quote instead of threatening to be sued, which I have many times. So that was fantastic. And we're AppOmni partners with ServiceNow. So it was a huge leap, because I don't believe any other SSPM or SaaS security company had gotten something like this. So that was fantastic. But so I conducted that research originally, performed that internal analysis so I productized that scan, looked at, okay, how bad is this? And I reported it to ServiceNow before they could fix it themselves. I wanted to take the credit for it. And this is the interesting thing. Initially, they came back and said, well, customers are misconfiguring this themselves. So what can we do? Like, it's on themselves. And I said, okay, well, here is exactly how I provided some metrics. And I said, here's exactly how bad it is. We've got access tokens. We've got ridiculous kind of information being stored there. And they said they would look into it. And within a day, they got back and said, okay, we need to do something, because we didn't realize it was this bad. And they were sending out emails. So they sent out emails to over 6,000 ServiceNow customers who had exposed data by accident to the public. And when I spoke to ServiceNow about it shortly after they sent those emails out, they just told me they were mostly ignored, right? To get one email in an inbox saying, hey, you're exposing all this data, and it just gets pushed down. A lot of people don't see it, or some people may not even think it's real, right? Or care, because there's no proof of concept of this. So we needed to do something. Now, in the background, through our productized scan, we were notifying our own customers about the findings and providing remediation steps that they could follow in order to basically stop the data exposure. And we had also gave them a heads up and said, look, we're going to disclose this publicly, and we're going to coordinate with ServiceNow in doing that. But it kind of lights a fire under people when you let them know in about 2 weeks, some apt group is going to just take everything. So our customers, the vast majority of them, had fixed the issue, but you still had these 6,000 organizations that were not AppOmni customers still exposing data. So what they did was, as I previously mentioned, they had just pushed this massive patch that just rolled back all these misconfigured access controls. And as I said, in doing so, they broke a lot of implementations, but unfortunately, it was just that widespread and that bad. They felt the need to do that. And it is the first time I've ever seen a SaaS vendor actually do something along those lines. Usually it is like, oh, we'll write a piece of documentation and bury it on our site, and the link's going to break 2 times a week. But that was a very, very bold move. And ultimately, in my opinion, for the better. So I believe that's my piece finished. Are you finished as well?
Done as well.
He's done as well.
We're up on
Okay.
time.
So do we have time?
I'm not sure. Yeah, if there's
Yeah, I'd love a
questions,
couple
we might
questions if
have
anyone
some
has
questions.
them.
Anyone wants to ask the man, the myth, the legend over here, or me? Nothing? Well, we're going to be here for a bit. Go for it.
Just a quick one is more you, when was that first time you found the first one of those open public APIs?
So that,
And sorry, and how is the market today?
and how is the which?
How is the market today? How is the company stating after you publish all this research?
So the first was 2021, I believe. And that was the Salesforce finding. And that really kind of shook everyone because, as I said, like every organization was just vulnerable to this. And that's when we realized at AppOmni, like, oh, this is really, really, really bad. And got the cogs in my head turning about other products, because surely some of the other massive platforms like Oracle's ERP, NetSuite, and ServiceNow had similar functionality. Because what I want to mention is when we look at those platforms, like they're like industry leaders, and the allure of those products is their complexity and flexibility and like customizability. So with Salesforce, it's like, yeah, you can deploy a site and do kind of whatever you want with it, you know? And those are the kinds of products where you will find things, 100%. And with respect to the market today, a lot more people take me seriously. Since 2021, a lot more people do. And honestly, as a result of the public disclosures, like I've that to thank, right? It's one thing serving our customers and productizing these things and protecting them, but by publishing all of these things publicly for everyone to see, to the benefit of the security community and organizations that don't use AppOmni, SaaS security has gotten a lot more traction. And naturally, as a result of things like Midnight Blizzard as well, organizations are taking it a lot more seriously. But one thing I do want to mention quickly is that, in my opinion, threat actors like these app groups don't really understand SaaS today. They don't really get it. I did an interview that was released yesterday with John Hammond. And in that, I showed briefly, here's real persistence. If we're talking persistence, here's an example in ServiceNow of really, if you're a threat actor, how to keep that persistence. Because threat actors are just dropping in like OAuth clients that run as an administrative user. And anyone's going to see that. It's very lame. And I described how you could, in ServiceNow, just completely hide your footprint. You could pivot to all these different systems. You could completely disable logs temporarily while you did all this. And within a couple of minutes, you basically have deployed all these backdoors, you've pivoted to different environments, and you will most likely not be found, right? So that's one concern that I have. As the market gets more knowledgeable, threat actors as well will get more knowledgeable and start to upskill with SaaS and these platforms.
Yeah, and I think just a couple of takeaways here for everyone, right? Is there's, other than, partnering with your business owners of these applications, whether that's your remit as cloud security professionals or whether that's with someone else in your org, what we commonly find is that no one's from security is working with their counterparts from the business teams that run these applications, right? So the first step is build that relationship, reach out to them and offer your guidance, because they're doing the best that they can, but they're not security professionals. They're just trying to deliver value to the business. So really basic things like, again, native authentication controls, disabling legacy authentication, right? The basic things are not being done. Obviously, there's more advanced things that we can do to help the SOC and help the business owners. But that's one piece. And the other piece is try to move upstream in the procurement exercise. We have a due diligence list of questions that security professionals can add to POCs for SaaS procurement around, hey, what is the SaaS vendor doing in terms of, are they providing the right attribution in their logs, right? Are they exposing the right information via API, security professionals that you want to gather and monitor if you don't want to buy a product? You want to do some own scripting on yourself? Like, are they even giving you the ability to do that? So there's some good open source stuff that we've done as well to help the community as a starting point. So we'll make sure that everyone has that afterwards. Tim? No, I think we had to wrap up.
I did. Thank you, Tim. I work with Tim. So yeah, at 2 p.m., we're releasing another blog post with data exposure again, and another major SaaS product again. And there is a little niche mention of something UK related. So you'll probably all be interested. So that's going live on the AppOmni blog at 2 p.m. So I'll be hanging around if you have any questions or want to interrogate me about that when it comes out. Feel free.